Hey everybody, how's it going? Let's talk about your home recording studio. Today I had hoped to get along with episode 3 of the Home Recording Basics series, but I've been having some computer problems, so I'm kind of dead in the water. I had to pull my computer from the rack, which is something I don't do very often because it's got a lot of stuff plugged into it. It's a pain in the butt to actually get it out of there and back in. Had a stick of RAM go bad in it, so it's currently limping along right now. But I figured since I've got it pulled from the rack, I've got it opened up and sitting on the floor here, so hey, maybe it's a good opportunity to take a look at what all's inside a recording computer. And if you're thinking about building your own computer for audio, a couple of pointers, a couple things to consider. So let's take a look here and see what we've got here. Alright, here we are. So, first, if I back up here and provide a little scale, like with my hand, you can see first that this is just a ridiculously large machine. When I was shopping for parts, I knew that I wanted a 4-space rack mount case. So that's going to determine this dimension. Each rack space, I think, is 1.75 inches. And so you multiply that by 4, so you've got a set dimension for the height of it. Since it's rack mount, there's going to be a set dimension for the width of it, which is 19 inches. That's just standard for anything that mounts in a rack. And what I did not consider when I bought this thing is how freaking deep it is. I mean, this thing is like, this could be like a tracking shot from like 2001 A Space Odyssey or something. I mean, this thing is just ginormous. It's so big. I had no idea when I bought it. Honestly, I would have bought a smaller chassis. But, it works. It's big and heavy, and it's steel outside. I mean, it is just a freaking beast. But inside, it's just a computer. It's got an audio computer. There's nothing too special about it. This is the Pro Tools unit. This over here, this is Easy Drummer right here, and this is the Auto-Tune Logic unit, not to be confused with the Logic Pro X Logic unit. If you're using Logic, you gotta have one of those. No, this is just BS. So really, there's nothing too special if you're going to build your own audio-based computer. Really, the big considerations to make is you want it to be quiet. You want it to be as quiet as possible. And you want it to at least have a baseline amount of processing power. If it's underpowered, you're going to have troubles with popping and skipping and latency and things like that. So really, number one, you want the best processor that you can afford. Processors are pretty much the single most expensive component in a computer. So getting like a true top-of-the-line, current, just killer processor is kind of a tough prospect because they're expensive. There's AMD, there's Intel. Intels are more expensive. If this were 5 or 10 years ago, I'd tell you it doesn't make a difference, but it seems that Intel has kind of lapped AMD when it comes down to it. I think they're just better processors. What I've used in this build is and this build is a couple years old. So this is an Intel i7 4770, and I have not yet made this thing really even break a sweat with anything audio related. This thing has been an absolute workhorse. It's been killer. It's a great chip. It doesn't generate a whole lot of heat, so I've just got the stock Intel cooler on it, and it has just been terrific. I could, even though this chip is at least a few years old, I have a hard time recommending anything else. I think it's a killer chip. By now, this is 2016. I'm sure, within a couple of years, any recommendation I make is not going to mean anything. But that thing has done great in this machine. The other big consideration is RAM. And in a in any computer. If I can get some focus here, you know, this particular one has 4 different slots for RAM. I say I wouldn't go with anything less than 8 gigabytes of RAM at this point. With 4 gig of RAM, I think you're going to run into just enough problems if you use like a sample library, like maybe EZDrummer or EZKeys or something that uses a lot of little samples that need to load into memory. Yeah, that's going to chew through 4 gig of memory plus whatever, you know, Windows needs to operate. That's going to go through it in a hurry. So I would recommend going with at least 8 gig. In this machine, I'd use 16 gig with 2 8 gig DIMMs, 2 8 gigabyte sticks of memory. Of course, one of them died on me. I still have 8 gig left, so I could fire up the machine, but this thing is such a pain in the butt to get out of there and get disconnected and get the cover off and install the new RAM once it comes. I'd rather leave it laying on the floor disabled than go through all that more than once. Alright, so another big consideration is storage. This is 2016, really. If you don't have at least a solid state drive running your system drive, like your C drive, oh man, I think you're losing out. Really, by this point, solid state technology is cheap. It is so fast. It's amazing how fast a computer boots when you have a solid state drive in it. Now for an audio machine, you have a couple other considerations. Let's see if I can get a shot here. I mean, they're just disk drives. I can't really get a camera in here to there's in this big giant chassis, surprisingly enough, not enough room to get a shot of the hard drive. Now, getting large solid state drives is still kind of pricey. Now, in this particular machine, I have 250 gigabyte system drive, like my C drive is solid state, but I used for 2 other drives, Western Digital Black, which I love those drives. They're priced very well, they're huge, they're high performance, they do a good job. About the only consideration for like spinning platter drives that you're going to need to make is make sure that they're at least 7,200 RPM. Anything slower than that, like the 5,000 RPM ones, those are going to be a little laggy, and you might run into some problems if you're trying to record multiple tracks of audio all at once. So at least a 7,200 RPM drive, the Western Digital Black or 7,200. I have 2 of those in this machine. They're each 1 terabyte. I dedicate one as my audio drive. I mean, that's where all my projects live. That's where I record my projects too. And the other one is dedicated to sample libraries, like EZDrummer, Stephen Slate drums, Superior Drummer, and those are, you know, all the expansion packs and everything for those. Those are really large libraries. It's kind of nice to have just 1 drive dedicated to those. Not necessary by any means, but just kind of a nice to have. Something to keep in mind if you're going to design your own build for an audio machine. Alright, so we covered CPU, we covered some RAM, some storage. The other main component when you're building, you know, any machine is the power supply. With a power supply, modern processors are getting so efficient with the advent of, or with the popularity of laptops, and laptops being run on batteries. There's been a huge advance in technology for processor efficiency lately. So really, you don't need a huge, big, badass power supply to run a modern computer, because the processors are so good at using relatively small amounts of power. In this particular one, I went with a 500 watt power supply. It's probably a little bit of overkill, and especially if you're not using a dedicated graphics card, then you know, the single biggest power hog in a modern computer is going to be the graphics chip. The processors are so good at being efficient, but the just sheer horsepower that a graphics card has, they tend to require a lot of power. I think that most modern graphics cards are going to require you have at least a 400 watt power supply. I went with a 500 watt, and that brings me to the graphics card. This is absolutely unnecessary in an audio machine. You're dealing with audio here, not video. But since I've been making these YouTube videos, I wanted a little extra horsepower in not only seeing real-time what I'm doing when editing, but also a little extra horsepower for rendering. Although that I'm still new at it and I haven't got a whole lot of benefit out of that yet. Graphics card, totally not necessary. What I found, I used this machine for 2 years with just the built-in graphics from the processor, and it was great. I could run 2 monitors. I never had it even break a sweat. So really, separate graphics card, not necessary, and a separate graphics card can actually be a detriment. The problem with using a separate graphics card is that they generate heat, and anytime there's heat you need to dissipate that heat, and the way that computers do that, they use fans. Cool, you use fans for cooling. The problem with that is fans make noise, and in an audio-based environment, noise is bad. Noise is very bad. Depending on what kind of graphics card you get. This particular one, this is an AMD Radeon R9 380, and it has like a smart fan technology on it. So that means when the graphics card is not under a very heavy load and not generating very much heat, the fans are dormant. The fans are silent, which is great. That's something that you're going to want to take into consideration. If your graphics card instead has fans that are going all the time, it's just going to make noise all the time. You don't want that. The less noise, the better. And when you're dealing with audio, it's not very CPU intensive, and it's not very graphics intensive. So your CPU usage, especially if you get a more modern CPU that can handle it, it's going to generate very little heat. Your graphics card will generate very little heat, and if your graphics card has some smart fan technology on it, then the fans aren't going to make any noise, and that's going to be great. But once things start heating up, it starts to get under a heavier load, those fans are going to kick in and make all sorts of noise, and it's going to make your life a living hell when you're trying to be quiet in a recording environment. Your microphone is going to hear that. One other consideration that you're going to want to make when selecting parts for an audio computer build is cooling, is your fans. The kind of rule of thumb here, and let's get in here and take a look. The rule of thumb is that you want larger fans. So this one in particular is a 120 millimeter fan. The reason why you want a larger fan is because they can move air at slower RPMs. They can move still a pretty significant amount of air, provide a pretty significant amount of cooling, without having to spin really, really fast. Because when they spin really, really fast, they make noise, that baffling noise. This fan at the rear of my chassis here, this is just an 80 millimeter fan, but that's the only, you can look at where it's situated here. That's the only option I had. So I specifically found some fans that were low noise. This one mounts with some rubber pins, mounts to the chassis, so it doesn't screw on with a metal screw. So that allows it to not transfer vibration to the rest of the computer and therefore make noise. But also there's no bearings in here or anything, so it's a very quiet fan when it's running. But it is 80 millimeter. Really, I would say if you at all have a choice, go for at least a 120 millimeter fan, because it can spin slower, not make nearly as much noise. I've got one more fan in the front of the machine here. I can't really quite see it. My lighting's not quite good here. So yeah, you want to keep things cool, but you have to kind of balance how much cooling you can get without making too much noise. Let's see, another consideration is the motherboard itself. So in this case, I chose a Gigabyte. It's one of their Z97 boards. Your choice of motherboard is going to be dependent on your choice of processor and what type of socket or connection your processor connects with. Honestly, I would not recommend this motherboard. I've been kind of unhappy with it. It's a little noisy. It tends to be, this one is a little susceptible to electromagnetic interference, and it tends to pick up some mechanical noise. You know, if a fan does kick on, this motherboard tends to kind of receive some of the electromechanical noise from that, and it drives me absolutely batty. Sometimes it actually comes through on my recordings, and you know, before too long, I think I'm going to give this motherboard the boot. I think it would be a great gaming motherboard, and that's really what it's designed for. But I'm going to need to find something a little quieter, a little better for my purposes. One other consideration you're going to need to make when selecting your motherboard is what type of slots it has in it, what type of cards it can accept based on the gear that you have. Now, in today's environment, there's not a whole lot of cards. You know, things are USB and FireWire and Thunderbolt, which are all connectors that are standard on any motherboard or on different motherboards. And they're all accessible from outside of the machine itself, so you don't have to crack open the machine, install a card just to get a connector. In a desktop machine, and especially if you're using like some legacy equipment, maybe your motherboard doesn't have FireWire ports built in, and you need a card dedicated to providing FireWire ports, or same for maybe Thunderbolt, or maybe you need more USB ports. You have a lot of USB peripherals and you need to install a USB card. So you need to make a consideration for what all types of devices you're going to want to install inside your computer. So for instance, on this one, at the time that I bought it, I was using this sound card. This is an M-Audio Delta 44, and it uses the old school PCI slot. And even 2 years ago, it was getting very difficult to find a motherboard that had an old PCI slot on it. So that was kind of part of the reason. And now I don't even use this anymore. I installed it, reinstalled it recently when my other audio interface was in the shop being repaired. But otherwise, I just been too lazy to take it back out and shelve it with the rest of the stuff. Really, the most common ones are going to be PCI Express, and that's what this big hunk of metal here plugs into a PCI Express. They're like the kind of miniature PCI Express things. On most computer part websites, you know, like Newegg or Tiger Direct or wherever you source your parts from, it's pretty easy to filter based on those things. And honestly, if you go to those websites, you know what you're doing anyways. So there's not a whole lot I can tell you that's going to be of help here. But yeah. So those considerations. Noise is a consideration. So choose your fans wisely. Buy the biggest fans that you can fit into your machine. You're going to want the best CPU that you can afford. Don't break the bank, but and it's going to be the most expensive part of your computer probably, is just the CPU. You want, I would say, go ahead and go with at least 8 gig of memory. I don't think you want to mess around with any less than that. Most modern motherboards are going to support at least a maximum of 32 gigs of memory. You don't really need to max that out because it's unlikely that you're going to need all that memory. But hey, if you find a good deal and your motherboard supports it, you're not going to hurt anything. Go ahead and toss 32 gig in there. I would really suggest going with 8, probably 16, especially if you're using sample libraries. Your storage, you're going to want ample storage. These audio files that you're creating while recording are going to be relatively large. They're substantially larger than an MP3 because they're much higher resolution files that you're dealing with. So you're going to want ample storage, and it's probably a good idea to use one hard drive for your operating system and all your applications, and that'll be just where you install stuff, and have at least one other drive that you can dedicate to recording audio. And that's going to help because the disk read head and the disk controller isn't going to have to do double duty of doing regular background operating system things at the same time as trying to write high fidelity, high bitrate audio to the same disk. So it's kind of a good idea to go ahead and dedicate one separate drive to just your audio of where you're going to actively record to. Now, I really do recommend using a solid state drive, at least for your system drive, just because it makes your computer just fly. It's great. I would say it's a little less necessary to dedicate a solid state drive to your audio drive, but that can be really nice because they're so high bandwidth, so high throughput. It can only make life easier, but I think at least if you use a 7200 RPM a spinning platter disc, I think that's going to be ample, and those are cheap nowadays. They're great. Okay, I think that's just about it for any advice I could give you on building your own audio machine. If you have any questions or comments, leave them below. Hopefully next time I see you, I'll have everything back up and running, and I'll actually have all my lighting and boom mic and everything all set up. So, hey, thank you very much for hanging with me. I'll see you guys next time.